group of Israelis, including the National Security Minister, has marched to an illegal settlement in the occupied West Bank, despite concerns that it may fuel more tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. Itamar Ben-Gvir joined hundreds of Israeli settlers in a rally supporting illegal settlements in the area, and the march started 5 kilometers from the Palestinian town of Huwara, where there's been a spike in violence between Palestinians and Israelis. And 23 Israeli groups today made incursions inside the Aqsa compound. That's as Palestinian worshippers conducted morning prayers. Earlier, hundreds of Palestinian youth were prevented from accessing the compound for dawn prayers. Tensions in the last week over access to the Temple Mount, sacred to both Judaism and Islam, during the sensitive holiday period have triggered fairly common cross-frontier fighting between Israel and Palestinian militant groups in the Gaza Strip. But in a rare development, they have drawn in Lebanon and now Syria. And Israel's police commissioner says images of Israeli forces beating Palestinian worshippers inside the Al-Aqsa mosque compound last week has caused a, quote, terrible impact. Kobi Shabtai, however, still defended the actions of Israeli forces in the comments he made to Israeli media, saying that they had to act to, quote, quell rioting attempts, adding that the incident is being investigated. More than a dozen Palestinian and police officers were injured at the time. Hundreds of others were arrested. Meanwhile, Palestinian health officials say Israeli troops have shot dead a 15-year-old Palestinian boy during a raid in the occupied West Bank. Palestinian officials named the boy as Mohammed Faiz Balhan. The Israeli army said its forces were operating in a refugee camp near Jericho without giving further details. Earlier, the army said 2 soldiers were lightly wounded during an overnight operation in Nablus in the northwest Bank. For more on the simmering tensions in the Middle East, let's cross live and speak with Arise special correspondent Karl Bostic, who joins us from our London studios. Good to see you, Karl. What's the mood like in the region after all those attacks of the other day? I mean, are things still quite tense?
Charles, if you just look at some of the comments that are coming from just neighboring countries, especially Arab neighbors, just to give an example, Jordan's foreign ministry issuing a statement over the weekend, late Saturday, saying that if there's another incursion or assault at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, like we saw last week on Wednesday, where worshippers are beaten, there will be catastrophic consequences for which everyone will pay the price. That's coming from Jordan. And I'll explain to you why a little bit later about why that's important. You've got the Gulf Cooperative Council that's made up of Gulf states that are also saying they're looking at this with great concern, saying that the consequences would reverberate around the Arab or Muslim world, because again, keep in mind, Charles, this is the third holiest shrine in the Muslim world, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then, of course, you have those salvos of rockets coming from Lebanon, also Gaza, the biggest barrage of rockets from Lebanon since 2006. Charles, what you see happening right now is so different than what we saw the last intifada that happened back in 2000 when Ariel Sharon visited those grounds at Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's a disputed or contested holy site, Charles, because it's sacred to both Muslims, but also Israeli Jews or Jewish people around the world. And very simply, out of the Six-Day War back in the 1960s, Charles, 1967, the arrangement was that Jordan would have custodial responsibility and security responsibility for the Al-Aqsa Mosque. In other words, no one could enter it without their permission. But instead, Israeli troops entered it, claiming that because Passover is now coinciding with Ramadan, they wanted to ensure that any Jewish person wanting to visit, but even though they can't pray, would not be harassed or intimidated. But they were concerned about hundreds of worshippers, Muslim worshippers, during Ramadan, Charles, barricading themselves inside, and they were claiming that the Muslim worshippers were stockpiling explosives, rocks, and stones to prevent Jewish people from entering. That's why, Charles, this next week could still really be more of a tinderbox, because finally, Charles, what's new is this. At the very beginning, you talked about this march to this settlement or legal outpost. It was not just any march, Charles. It was also attended by cabinet ministers of Netanyahu's new government. For the first time in Israeli history, you have a far-right government that's really dominated by ultra-nationalists who are saying that we don't like this status quo. We don't like this agreement with that gives Arabs and Palestinians so much control of the compound. We want Jewish people to take back control of this mosque, and we want more settlements. That's what's playing out now.
Well, that's very interesting, and I'm glad you mentioned that last bit, because that is actually quite crucial and very important. Senior Israeli ministers essentially pushing for a change in policy on Temple Mount. But what's beyond that, of course, there is potentially the worry about escalation outside Israel and the Palestinian territories. I wonder what your assessment is, Karl, of the risk of escalation with neighboring countries, because of course rockets have been fired into Israel, not just from Gaza, but from southern Lebanon and from Syria.
Charles, let's put things in real serious perspective. Right now, we're seeing so far that diplomacy is simply not working out. Charles, at the end of February, there was a meeting convened by the U.S. where Jordanians, Egyptians, Palestinians, and Israelis met in the Jordanian port city of Aqaba, where a communique was released saying that they would not only commit to de-escalation, but also ensure that there would be no more repopulation of settlements, no more increase of settlements. 2 weeks later, Charles, beginning of March, you had another meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh between Palestinian and Israeli officials, again supervised, convened by the U.S., promising not to escalate this further and promising to uphold the status quo. What's new is this, Charles. You've got basically, senior ministers of the Israeli government saying that we don't like this status quo. It was an historical mistake. And even beyond what's going on in Ramadan and the risk or threat of an incursion inside that mosque, they're saying we're going to repopulate with even more settlements, Charles. If I can give you one quick quote that came from the ministers. This is from Itamar Ben-Gvir this afternoon, Charles. He says, "We do not blink. We are returning home to the land of Israel, returning home to the Temple Mount." He also says, we legalized 9 outposts, and with God's help, we will legalize more. He says, we will build, settle, and directly engage those seeking to harm us. And then you have the finance minister who's in charge of settlements. He's going on further to say, Charles, he's saying, with God's help, we will bring another 500,000 Jews here, in addition to the 500,000 who are already here. And as the one in charge of settlements, Charles, he's saying they're already trying to legalize another 70. That 500,000 number is significant, Charles, because already there are 500,000 Jews living inside of occupied West Bank Palestinian territory, a tenth of Israel's population living in the West Bank as we speak, and they want to add more.
Very interesting, very complicated, and thanks to you for trying to untie the knot there for us. Of course, Karl Bostic is our special correspondent, and he was talking to me from our studios in London.